Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a very special 5-part podcast series on the Hughes Hubbard Reed Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert, which was recently released. In this 5-part podcast series, we take a look at 5 separate areas that are touched upon in the alert. They include an overview of the alert, the U.S. FCPA component, the French developments in anti-bribery, anti-corruption, enforcement, and compliance programs, multilateral development banks and their role in the fight against bribery and corruption, and we conclude with a review of anti-bribery enforcement in Brazil, along with Brazilian authorities' embracement of compliance. The alert is a significant piece of research, but more importantly than simply listing cases, it gives you a deep dive into the analysis of both anti-bribery, anti-corruption enforcement, but also policy announcements by regulators and other commentary from countries outside the United States about the state of compliance and where it's going forward. In this part 2, I'm joined by partner Laura Perkins to discuss the FCPA developments over the past year. This special series on the Hughes Hubbard Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert has been a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode in our 5-part podcast series with Hughes Hubbard lawyers on their 2019 FCPA Alert. Today, I'm extraordinarily thrilled to have back Laura Perkins, partner at Hughes Hubbard, and we're going to talk about one of our joint favorite topics, which is the FCPA. So, Laura, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, thank you for coming back and welcome back to the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be back.
Laura, each year I don't think things can really evolve or change in the world of the FCPA, but I found this year to be as highly significant, not only in the area of FCPA enforcement, but also in FCPA policy and communications. And I was wondering where you sit as a partner at Hughes Hubbard, but also as a former DOJ, or what are your kind of general thoughts on the year in general?
As you said, it was an interesting year. It always is in FCPA enforcement. I think that from the DOJ perspective, or the DOJ side of anti-corruption enforcement, we saw some pretty interesting things and developments, like you said, again, in the policy space and in messages that DOJ sent to practitioners, and both through their policies, but I think even more significantly through the language in some of the enforcement actions, where I think a lot of the points that DOJ is trying to make to the market were communicated. So I found that to be interesting this year in particular. I also thought that it was interesting to see the evolution of the corporate enforcement policy. Upon the issuance of the corporate enforcement policy, there was a lot of speculation about how will the presumption play out, what will this mean for companies, what will DOJ do with the discretion it granted itself under the enforcement policy. And I think that this year was one where we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of movement on that front. So it was interesting to watch.
So we had some really interesting enforcement actions, literally from cases involving hundreds of $millions in fines and penalty and disgorgement, down to cases which were relatively small in terms of their overall fines and penalties. But as you suggest, Laura, and I thought some important language in the settlement documents that were released, which really helps guide the compliance practitioner. What did you see as some of the key enforcement actions from your perspective?
So I think that one is Walmart, particularly in the compliance space. I think it's significant for not only what the resolution talks about, but also just in that it has been such a highly speculated about or anticipated resolution. And so I think just the mere fact that it was resolved was significant. I think also for Walmart, it was significant in the monitorship space. It's the first monitorship in the FCPA space that was tailored really in the way that the Walmart monitorship has been tailored. So I think that those are some significant pieces from that resolution. I also think that the Fresenius resolution was very interesting, again, going to the point of seeing how the corporate enforcement policy will play out in instances where there would be a presumption, but DOJ uses its discretion to not follow the presumption. And I think that's what we saw in Fresenius, where there was a voluntary disclosure, there was cooperation, and there was remediation, but they didn't receive a declination and instead received a non-prosecution agreement. So I think that, while there were definitely numerous other enforcement actions of interest, those are two that I found particularly noteworthy this year.
Laura, I was wondering if I might ask you about Cognizant Technologies, because in that case, in your opening remarks, you talked about how the DOJ communicated not only solid compliance points for the compliance practitioner, but how they might think through a enforcement action. And I think Cognizant Technologies began as a head scratcher, but the more the DOJ communicated, the more it became clear the message they were putting out. And that was where we had C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme, yet the company was able to obtain a declination. And in the settlement documents, it talked about the board of directors self-disclosed within 2 weeks of being notified of the compliance or FCPA violation. Is that the type of communication you indicated that the DOJ is putting out there in their enforcement actions?
Yes. I think both in Cognizant and if you look at all DOJ resolutions, there is always a paragraph that lays out the relevant considerations that DOJ looked to when deciding on the form of the resolution and on any discount they give for a fine. And that is the place where practitioners should look for points for tips, essentially, from DOJ as to what they think is significant. And so in Cognizant, they did have a fairly long, sort of, as I'll refer to it, relevant considerations paragraph, where they were really speaking to practitioners and to the market to try to explain why it was that they took the action that they took and provide, in a sense, guidance to the market as to what steps they could take if they find themselves in such a situation to receive the sorts of benefits that Cognizant received.
As you also noted, it was, I thought, a really significant year in terms of policy changes, policy amendments, policy modifications. I was wondering, for you, what were some of the key policy announcements from the Department of Justice?
So there were, as you note, a number of policy announcements, including sort of some revisions to the corporate enforcement policy, some memorializing of the monitor selection process, and the compliance guidance that was issued. Given the fact that a lot of those documents and that guidance was previously provided, albeit kind of in a different form, I found the most significant thing about those announcements to be the fact that they were made under the new administration. And in essence was the new administration embracing the policy announcements of the previous administration. And it was, I think, a clear message to the market, which really did question how will the new administration proceed with regard to these policies that we have come to accept and operate under. Will they stay? Will they change? And I think the fact that the new administration essentially reissued the former policies in virtually identical format was a very clear message to the market that this is how the Department of Justice is going to proceed going forward, regardless of sort of who's in the White House and what party is in control, that this is the way FCPA enforcement is going to move forward. And I found that to be very impactful and important, sort of the embracing by both parties of these types of policies.
Laura, you talked about how we being compliance practitioners, corporate compliance professionals, and white-collar defense lawyers can find tips in a lot of the settlement documents. But I was wondering if there were other significant communications from the Department of Justice to compliance practitioners that you found over the past year.
Well, I think the again, adoption and sort of conversion of the compliance questions into the compliance guidance, although it was issued to prosecutors, that compliance guidance, I think, is very helpful to compliance practitioners and is a great place for practitioners in the compliance space to look to understand what is it that the department looks at when it evaluates compliance programs, so that when compliance professionals are evaluating their own program or perhaps enhancements to it, what steps is the department seeing in either failing programs or in state-of-the-art programs? So a very helpful, I think, guide to look to for compliance practitioners. I think there are also, this year in particular, have been a number of statements by the department about sort of failures in investigating misconduct once it's found. So in Walmart, for example, the department noted the failings in sort of the internal investigation that Walmart conducted and the adequacy of the staffing that was put toward that internal investigation in the early stages. So I think that if practitioners look closely at both the relevant considerations paragraphs as well as some of the more compliance-related discussions in the enforcement actions, they can find a lot of very helpful tips from the department.
Laura, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today in this episode with Laura Perkins, and we've been talking about the FCPA highlights over the past year that were in the Hughes Hubbard 2019 FCPA Alert. Laura, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode in our special 5-part podcast series on the Hughes Hubbard Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert. I've linked to it in the show notes, and I would urge you to check it out, download it, and read it at your leisure. There's lots packed into it. And of course, best of all is the price, which is it's free. This series has been a presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.